The box wasn't supposed to mean anything. It was the kind of sagging, sun-softened cardboard that thrift stores receive by the dozens. Estate cleanouts, sudden moves, the quiet housekeeping of grief. A teenage volunteer slid a box cutter through the old packing tape, expecting sweaters and picture frames. What fell out first was a wool sport coat that smelled like cedar chips and thyme. And then, almost by accident, a letter. It wasn't just a letter. It was a time capsule sealed with wax, the flap pressed shut by a signet that left a crisp impression of 3 pine needles. A mark so particular it felt like a whisper. The paper had aged to a color somewhere between bone and tea. On the envelope, a name in careful blue ink, to Maya Hart, if found. The return address block was empty. The postmark area was blank too, no stamp, no cancellation. Whoever wrote it hadn't trusted the mail. The volunteer didn't know Maya Hart. He didn't know that 27 years earlier, on October 14th, 1998, Maya had been 16 years old and watching the sky over North Carolina empty itself of light, while news anchors said a name that would tattoo itself into hundreds of lives. Ridge Airways Flight 7028. He didn't know the way that night froze a family at a dinner table in Raleigh at the end of a cul-de-sac loud with cicadas, when the phone rang and Maya's mother sank into a chair so fast the legs squealed on linoleum. He didn't know that the coat the letter had fallen from once belonged to Liam Carter, seat 14A, an unremarkable man with a remarkable habit of keeping promises. The thrift store manager taped the letter to the counter with a post-it, "Lost item, ask," scribbled in Sharpie. It would have sat there for days, if not for a retired librarian named Ruthie Pike, who saw the name and felt the prick of recognition. She remembered the local memorial, the bronze names cut into a wall like windows that would never open. She remembered Maya's mother, who had given a talk at the library 6 months after the crash, about not letting tragedy define the last sentence of someone's life. Ruthie was the kind of neighbor who keeps Christmas cards. She found one at home with a return address in neat loops. M. Hart. Ruthie made a call. The phone that rang in Maya's kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon in June was the same landline that had carried the worst sentence of her life in 1998. She almost didn't answer, but she did, and a soft voice told her there was a letter with her name on it, found in a coat that once belonged to a man from Flight 7028. By evening, the letter was on Maya's table, the wax seal intact. She stared at it under the yellow cone of a pendant lamp. Her hands felt like someone else's, cool, decisive, as she pried the flap with a butter knife. The seal cracked with a sound that should have been louder. Inside was a single sheet, folded twice, inked by a fountain pen that sometimes blotted. The handwriting leaned forward like it was trying to reach her. "Maya, if you're reading this, it means I failed to get where I promised. I don't know a kind way to say this, so I won't. The flight I'm on is not what it appears. I've done a reckless thing, believing it was the right thing. I was told to carry something to someone who would know what to do with it, because if it went through normal hands, it would vanish. I have been followed for 2 days. If anything happens, the reason won't be weather. Look for the 3 pine needles. Tell them what you told me about your mom, that she isn't afraid of the truth." L.C. Maya read it once, then again, then a 3rd time until the words separated from meaning and became only shapes. If anything happens, the reason won't be weather. But the official story had always been weather. A fast-moving system, a microburst near the Appalachians, a cockpit overwhelmed during descent. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, found no bomb, no hijacking, no mechanical smoking gun. The case had been written off as a cruel coincidence of pressure and human error. She laid the letter beside a faded folder she kept in a desk drawer, the one she swore she wouldn't open again. Photocopies of the accident report, clippings, the passenger manifest with highlighter over Liam Carter. He had been her mother's friend from volunteer work, the one who brought board games to family picnics and let Maya cheat at Scrabble by testing words out loud. 2 weeks before the flight, Liam had asked Maya for a favor: to keep an eye on a P.O. box while he was traveling. "If anyone else asks about it, don't tell them you know me," he'd said, laughing like it was a joke. The letter made it sound like it hadn't been a joke at all. Maya's first call was to a name she had underlined 3 times in her old notes: Evelyn Cho, the junior NTSB investigator who had been attentive to families, the one who returned calls long after the investigation closed. Evelyn answered on the 3rd ring, recognized the name, and was quiet for a long moment. When Maya read the letter, "Bring it tomorrow," she said. "And Maya, don't send photos of it to anyone yet. We'll do this carefully." Outside, the summer air pressed against the windows like a held breath. Maya slid the letter back into its envelope, then into a freezer bag, as if it were an organ being rushed to surgery. She did not sleep much that night. Somewhere, in a thrift store bin, a coat hung a little lighter. In a city archive, a case file labeled Flight 7028. Closed, exhaled dust. It hadn't moved in years. At 7:45 the next morning, Maya pulled out of her driveway, the letter on the passenger seat, the landline unplugged from the wall. "Do you want me to continue to Chapter 2? Chapter 2, the night the sky tilted Blue Ridge Airways Flight 7028 was a short hop on the map and a long one in memory. Scheduled from Denver to Raleigh with a stop in Nashville, it was the kind of midweek flight that filled with consultants and grandmothers, soldiers on leave, and students with heavy backpacks. The airplane, a twin-engine narrow-body with tired upholstery and a confidence born of thousands of landings, pushed back at 5:37 p.m. Mountain Time on October 14, 1998. The captain, Raymond Ray Delaney, had logged 22 years in the left seat. His first officer, Cara Villanueva, was fresh off a commendation for a textbook diversion in bad weather. Dispatch notes from that afternoon, now the color of fax paper and coffee stains, warned of a line of convective storms sliding east. Nothing unusual for autumn, nothing the route planners hadn't seen before. But the Appalachians have a way of turning ordinary weather into a lesson. By the time 7228 leveled at 33,000 feet, the storm line was a neon bruise on radar. The crew threaded the gaps and made up time. Passengers like Liam Carter in 14A and Aisha Monroe in 22C, traveling to her sister's baby shower, accepted ginger ale and pretzels. A toddler near the rear bulkhead discovered the word "again" and practiced it on his father's eyelids. What the public would later know by a mosaic of headlines was more chaotic in real time. After the stopover in Nashville, 7228 launched east again into a sky that couldn't decide between dusk and menace. At 9:11 p.m. Eastern, approach cleared them to descend. Wind shear advisories lit the controller's console. A squall line crossed their arrival corridor like a marching band that didn't see the traffic light. Cara called out airspeed fluctuations. Ray worked the throttles like an organist. The sound in the cockpit on the CVR tape that would later be passed like scripture tightened. At 9:18:53 p.m., the ground proximity warning system chimed its metallic, indifferent voice. "Sync rate. Pull up." In the tape's final seconds, there's a jumble of rain noise, an attempt to arrest the descent, a human voice saying a name that the transcriber thought might have been Liam or Please. The impact came in a sparsely wooded ridge west of Black Creek, North Carolina, a shale hillside catastrophic to metal and merciful to fire. The fuselage broke into 5 primary sections, scattering in a fan that stopped just short of a creek bed choked with wet leaves. First responders were at the scene within minutes. Volunteer firefighters in boots laced over pajamas, deputies with light bars flashing blue on the underbellies of low clouds. A handful of passengers were alive on arrival. Some stayed that way. Aisha Monroe, tangled in seatbelts and shock, would later tell a nurse that she remembered a man unbuckling her saying, "We're not done yet," then vanishing. She could never be certain if he was real or a brain's gift in a moment of unspeakable need. The investigation began with familiar choreography: orange tape, command tents, the arithmetic of parts and people. The NTSB team worked daylight to dusk for weeks, piecing together a narrative whose bones were weather and pilot workload. The flight data recorder showed a sudden loss of indicated airspeed and a descent profile consistent with getting caught at the wrong place in a microburst. The CVR gave them human texture, the task saturation, the callouts, but no conspiracy. The cause, as the final report would print, was a loss of control due to wind shear encounter during approach, with contributing factors of inadequate real-time weather avoidance and crew resource management challenges. There were questions, of course. There always are. Why did the wind shear detection not trigger earlier alerts? Were the dispatchers too bullish, pushing departures ahead of a volatile line? Did maintenance deferments on a pitot heat system play any role? Those were asked, catalogued, answered, and set aside. The boxes were checked, the recommendations were issued, the case closed. Families were offered settlements that felt like math instead of mercy. What the report could not see was a letter sealed with wax, written by a man in 14A who believed something besides weather had boarded with him. What it didn't capture was the quiet pressure outside the margins of procedure, the way a proud regional carrier protected its on-time culture, the way cost-cutting had become a mythos told in shareholder decks and morning briefings. None of that proved malice. None of it proved anything except that complex systems sometimes fail exactly the way they are allowed to fail. On the second morning after the thrift store call, Maya Hart and Evelyn Cho sat under the fluorescent hum of an office that smelled like old toner and carpet shampoo. The letter lay between them in a plastic sleeve. Evelyn's fingers hovered over it like she was testing a hot iron. "If this is genuine," she said, "it's not something we ignore." "Genuine," Maya repeated, tasting the word. The ink, the wax, the voice, everything in her said it was Liam. He had a way of writing like he thought in paragraphs. He had the 3 pine needles on his keychain, embossed in brass. He had told her, once in the grocery line, that being brave wasn't about not being scared. It was about picking the thing you loved more than your fear and walking in that direction. Evelyn pulled a legal pad toward her. "We'll need chain of custody," she said. "A forensic doc examiner. And, if this turns into anything, subpoenas. But first, we need to understand who he meant by they and what the 3 pine needles point to." Maya took a breath that reached her toes. Somewhere in the building, a copier warmed itself into a future of paper. Something, at last, had shifted. "Do you want me to continue to Chapter 3? Chapter 3, 3 pine needles. The emblem appeared in more places than Maya expected once she knew to look. 3 pine needles, bound at the base, stylized into a minimalist fan, etched on the back of a brass key fob Liam used, stamped into the corner of a leather notebook he carried to meetings, scribbled in the margins of a crossword where he had been too impatient to wait for a pen. To Maya, it had always been Liam's private crest, a Forest Kid's inside joke. To Evelyn, it looked like a logo. Logos leave trails. By late afternoon, Evelyn had a list of companies registered in North Carolina whose marks suggested pine trees. Most were landscaping outfits, artisanal soap makers, a brewery. One, Tri-Needle Consulting, was different. It had no website. Its registered address was a suite in a shared office building that had been home to a dozen LLCs dissolved within a year. Its founding documents listed managers with forgettable names and P.O. boxes. The Secretary of State's records were neat, precise, and strangely frictionless, as if the entity existed just enough to satisfy the law and not an inch more. Maya stared at the Tri-Needle name on Evelyn's monitor. "Could it be a front?" she asked, feeling both dramatic and correct. "It could be a shelf company," Evelyn said. "It could be a nothing, or it could be a conduit. We don't know yet." She dialed a number she hadn't used in years. Marcus Reed, an investigative journalist whose pieces on transportation oversight had once made agency heads swallow hard. He answered from a coffee shop, his voice edged with espresso and deadlines. "Cho," he said, surprised and pleased. "I thought you'd defected to quiet work." "Quiet never suited me," she said, and told him the story in the thin strokes she could risk over the phone. Letter, 3 pine needles. Passenger in 14A. Marcus whistled. "If this is what I think it is, somebody tried to thread a needle and bled out on the way." He met them that evening in a diner that still believed in pie as a food group. He brought a battered accordion folder, and more importantly, his sense of pattern. While the waitress refilled mugs, he laid out photocopies of maintenance deferral logs from Ridge Airways around the time of the crash. "They were under pressure," he said. "Regional carriers often are. Shortage of parts, new routes coming online, weather chewing up schedules. I circled every time they deferred non-critical maintenance on avionics or pitot heat systems that month. It's not damning, but it makes me itch." Evelyn leaned in. "The final report looked at those. Nothing outside policy, but policy is elastic." Maya listened, the letter hot in her bag. She thought about Liam writing on the plane, the way his hand must have shaken with turbulence or fear. She thought about the line, "If anything happens, the reason won't be weather." From the beginning, weather had been the form of the story, the stage direction. But form is not cause. Lightning can illuminate a theater without writing the script. Marcus tapped a page. Tri-Needle Consulting shows up in procurement records as a vendor for documentation services, which is strange because there are no invoices, no deliverables, just retainer payments that start 3 months before 7028 and stop a week after. If I were laundering pressure, I might call it documentation. "Pressure?" Maya asked. "On a mechanic to sign off on something that should have grounded a bird. On a dispatcher to push a flight into a weather window because we can't cancel any more today without eating the month. On a parts manager to reuse a sensor past comfort because the replacement is on back order." Marcus shrugged. "None of that is a villain in a mask. It's systems rubbing wrong." Evelyn's pen scratched across her pad. "We need a forensic on the letter," she said, "but we also need to secure anything that looks like a tri-needle trail before it goes dark. Marcus, can you FOIA the procurement database? Quietly?" He smiled without humor. "Quiet is relative, but I can try." Maya thought of her mother, now living in a retirement community where the mornings were soft and the afternoons were bingo. She hadn't told her yet about the letter. What did a reopened wound look like at 70? Courage wore different clothes at different ages. For Maya, Courage that week wore sneakers and a denim jacket and the stubborn refusal to let a polite conclusion sit on top of an impolite truth. On her way home, she pulled into a park where longleaf pines peeled themselves in cinnamon curls. She looked up into the canopy until her neck hurt. 3 needles to a bundle. That was what made a longleaf distinctive, her 5th grade science teacher had said. 3 needles bound together, resilient in wind. It was a nice metaphor until it wasn't, until it was a breadcrumb. Her phone vibrated, a text from an unknown number. "You don't know me. I worked the hangar in '98. I'm ready to talk now." Below it, a photo of a brass key fob glinting in a palm. The 3 pine needles, worn smooth by years of pocket. The message had no name, no promise, just the heat of something about to catch. "Do you want me to continue to Chapter 4? Chapter 4. The Mechanic Who Waited. He called himself Owen Briggs, though later Maya would learn that wasn't the name on his social security card. They met in a car wash at the edge of an industrial park where the vacuums howled like wind tunnels. Owen was 50-something and brick-shouldered, with hands that had forgotten how to be idle. He wore a ball cap whose logo had faded to a ghost. "I kept the key fob," he said without preamble, as if confessing a theft. "Found it in a locker long after the crash. I thought I'd toss it one day, couldn't." He set the brass on the hood of Maya's car, the 3 needles catching the morning sun. I recognized it when I saw that old article about your mother's speech. He always had it. Told me it meant 3 truths are better than 1. Liam? Maya asked, and Owen nodded once. They sat on the low curb, and he told her about Hangar 6 in the months before the accident. The parts shortage that everyone swore would be over next week, the way the maintenance operations control line rang like a church bell every hour, the way the whiteboard filled with deferred items in dry erase hieroglyphs only insiders could pass. We weren't cowboys, he said. We didn't pencil whip sign-offs. But sometimes you get told to aim for the spirit of the rule because the letter will ground your fleet. He looked at his hands. You know what that makes you after a while? Tired. And then you make mistakes tired people make. Owen had known Liam Carter as a regular face, a volunteer who brought coffee to the hangar on midnight shifts, who helped with charity flight days for kids. He wasn't crew, he wasn't paid. He just showed up, Owen said. But the last month, he showed up different, asking about paperwork, asking who decides what gets deferred. He said he was helping a friend. I thought, mind your lane, pal. But he brought donuts. In the week before Flight 7028, Owen had been assigned to troubleshoot intermittent readings from a pitot heat system on the accident aircraft's sister ship. The parts had been ordered, the delays explained, the workaround logged and approved. We did the procedure, he said, by the book. But the book depends on the reader. He glanced up at the sky where a jet's contrail had been erased by wind. I signed a deferral I wasn't proud of. Not on your plane, on another. Still keeps me up. What does this have to do with Tri-Needle Consulting? Maya asked. Owen's eyes flicked to the empty bay beside them, as if sound could leak from secrets. Tri-Needle was a joke in the hangar. We called them the ghost auditors. Some third-party documentation firm that looked over our maintenance records to optimize compliance workflows. You know what that means? He didn't wait. It means they told us the safest way to write the truth, so it hurt the least. He pulled a creased business card from his wallet. Tri-Needle Consulting, Compliance and Documentation Services. No names. A Raleigh P.O. box. A phone number that now returned only the patient voice of a recorded operator saying the line had been disconnected. I think Liam was supposed to pass something to someone who didn't want to be seen meeting him, Owen said. He told me, if I can get this to a reporter, maybe we change the way they count risk. He laughed because he always laughed when he was scared. Maya told Owen about the letter, about the line that had carved a groove in her skull. The reason won't be weather. Owen flinched like someone had brushed a bruise. Weather is a reason, he said, but it's the kind lawyers like, the kind that doesn't get anyone fired. Evelyn joined them for the last 10 minutes, having waited in her car to let trust expand. She collected the business card in a plastic sleeve. If Tri-Needle touched records, she said, there will be footprints in metadata somewhere, deletions, edits. We just have to know where to look. Look in the places someone thought no one would bother, Owen said. Old backup tapes, the intern's PC they forgot to wipe before surplus. We kept a lot of ghosts. As they stood, Owen touched the brass fob with the 3 needles. I told myself I'd talk when I was no longer scared or angry, he said. Turns out you don't get to pick. You just talk when you can't not. He walked away, without waiting for thanks, shoulders squared against a wind that hadn't started yet. Maya slid the key fob into her pocket. It felt heavier than it looked. That afternoon, Marcus texted a screenshot of a public records portal, pending request, BLRA procurement ledgers, 1998-1999. Clock starts now, he wrote. If anyone is still guarding ghosts, they just got a calendar invite. Do you want me to continue to Chapter 5? Chapter 5. Ghosts in the Code. Data ages like people. Some parts stiffen, others go soft, and the surprises are in the scar tissue. Evelyn's hunch about metadata was right. Within a week, a city IT tech named Priya Nair unlocked an attic door in the county archive that not even the archivist had a key for anymore. Behind it, Under a blue tarp sat 3 DDS3 backup tape drives and a banker's box of tapes labeled in Sharpie, Blur, Doc, Q3-Q4 1998. The tape labels, charmingly optimistic, suggested a world where you could put 4 months into one box and be done with it. Priya set up a little lab in a conference room that smelled like lemon cleaner and old binders. She coaxed the tape drives back to life with patience and a can of compressed air, the way you wake a skittish animal. Bits trickled into a hard drive. What came back wasn't neat. It never is. File systems half-saved, email PSTs truncated, document caches with file names like final really ... But in the debris were artifacts of Trineedle's touch. Revision histories with user IDs that didn't match employee rosters, macros signed by a certificate from Trineedle Doc SVCS, and a PDF stamped draft, do not distribute, that outlined a harmonization protocol for maintenance logs. The protocol wasn't illegal, it was creative. It recommended phrasing that emphasized environmental factors over operational discretion when both applied, and standardizing descriptions across similar events to reduce interpretive variance by external reviewers. In plainer English, say weather when you can. Keep human choices in the background unless you absolutely can't. Evelyn read the PDF, then exhaled like someone who had been holding a plank for a minute too long. "This isn't the smoking gun," she said, "but it's the room where they kept the smoke." Among the tapes was a fragment of an email thread between a BLRA operations manager and a Tri-Needle consultant 9 days before the crash. The subject line, visibility into pitot heat deferments. The body, reconstructed from text fragments, included the sentence, "Given procurement delays, recommend proactive narrative consistency across airspeed IAS adjacent anomalies during approach, e.g. crosswinds, precip, shear, especially if crew reports workload." Maya stared at the word narrative until it blurred. She thought about the way stories are told after disasters, how they ossify into a single digestible arc. The line between true and convenient can fit on the point of a pin if you file it long enough. Marcus, meanwhile, had drawn the ire of a procurement clerk who left him a voicemail that began, "I don't know who you think you are," which was how he knew he was close. The ledgers, when they finally arrived, showed retainer payments to Tri-Needle routed through a management services umbrella that also handled corporate travel and, ironically, crisis communications. The retainer stopped on October 21st, 1998, 1 week after the crash, with a terse memo, "Terminate, per counsel." "What did Liam carry?" Maya asked one evening. The letter spread on her kitchen table like a compass. He says, "Carry something to someone who would know what to do with it." If it was these tapes, how did they survive? If it was a document, why not email? "Because you don't email something you think someone has the power to make vanish," Marcus said. "You put it in a pocket and you move your body through space and hope you get there." Evelyn made a list of names: in-house counsel, operations manager, maintenance chief, Tri-Needle liaison. Some were retired. One was dead. 2 didn't return calls. One, Marjorie Midge Halpin, answered on the second ring and said she had been waiting 27 years for the other shoe. They met Midge in a house filled with glass sun catchers and the smell of eucalyptus. She had been Bellari's assistant general counsel in '98, junior enough to be sent to fetch coffee, senior enough to know where the bodies weren't buried because she had filed the paperwork that left them above ground. She remembered Liam. "He was the rare volunteer, you remember," she said. "Not because he wanted something, but because he didn't. He just cared." Midge told them about a lunchtime where Liam had shown her a floppy disk with a pine needle sticker on it. He said, "If something happens to me, it's because of what's on here." I told him not to be dramatic. He smiled and said he'd always wanted to be dramatic just once. She put the disc in a drawer and forgot it until a week later when BLRA security politely asked to look through council files for anything that might complicate external communications. "Did they find it?" Evelyn asked. Midge shook her head. "I had moved it to my purse. Then I moved it to a safety deposit box after the memorial. Then life moved me." She took a small key from a dish by the door. "Would you like to meet your ghost? Do you want me to continue to Chapter 6? Chapter 6. The disc. People forget how a 3.5-inch floppy feels in the hand, the way it clicks when it decides to trust you. The safety deposit clerk looked like he had been born after floppies died. He handled the disc like a museum artifact. Back at Priya's ad hoc lab, they fed it into a USB drive that whirred with the optimism of adapters everywhere. The disk contained a single encrypted zip file named longleaf.zip. The password hint in a small README was the braver of the two. Maya stood very still. In middle school, Liam had taught her to climb a low boulder in the park. When she froze halfway up, he'd said, "Two voices in your head, the scared one and the brave one. Which one do you want to practice today?" She had said, "the braver of the two," and he'd made her repeat it like a spell. She typed braver. The archive opened like a held breath released. Inside were 4 documents. Harmonize v4.doc, a more explicit version of the protocol Priya had found, with tracked changes revealing comments from tri-needle accounts like "too blunt," reframe as industry standard alignment, and remove mention of deferment counts, exposes trend line. Pitot heat deferments OT.XLS, a spreadsheet with tail numbers, dates and internal notes on intermittent Pitot heat issues across the fleet, including the accident aircraft and its sister ships. Dispatch guidance 101398.MSG, an Outlook message from operations encouraging dispatchers to maximize throughput in advance of forecasted front and to use established language if crew requests returns for non-critical anomalies. Handoff.txt, a text file, plain and spare. "If I don't make it to MR on WED, give to EC. They'll know what to do." "MR is me," Marcus said, stunned quiet. "He was coming to me." He swallowed. "EC?" Evelyn looked like someone had stepped through her grave twice. "Me." The room changed temperature. There are moments when the past expands like an accordion and plays its song at full volume. The artifacts weren't an indictment of a single villain. They were a map of complacencies hardened into practice, of language used as a gauze to wrap cuts that needed stitches. The spreadsheet showed 12 Pitot heat deferments in October alone, 3 on the accident aircraft in the 10 days prior to the crash. The comments suggested unease. One mechanic wrote, "Temporary fix holding, but uncomfortable with extended ops in precip." Next to it, a red OK per guidance. Evelyn pressed a palm to her forehead. The official cause emphasized weather. That's not wrong, but this changes weight. It changes where we put our finger on the scale. They plotted next steps, like a chessboard, secure copies with hash verifications, draft affidavits for chain of custody, loop in a U.S. attorney who had once told Evelyn, "If you ever find the thing you think you'll never find, call me before sunrise." Maya called her mother. Her mother listened to Maya describe the disc in the halting way people tell good news they're afraid to believe. After a minute, her mother said, "He always said the truth has good bones. You can build on it." Then softer, "Come by before it gets dark." They sat at the small kitchen table that had been the command center of their grief for years. Her mother held the brass key fob, the 3 pine needles, and rolled it in her hand like a worry stone. "When the memorial wall went up," she said, "I told myself that was the last new thing, that from then on, everything would be remembering. But look at us. We're in the middle of the story again." Maya thought of Liam on the plane, the way he had hedged his bet by writing to 2 people, Marcus and Evelyn, 2 vectors of accountability in a world designed to bear weight. He had believed fiercely that the truth would outlive him. That belief had felt naive to Maya for years. Now it felt like a baton being pressed into her hand. Do you want me to continue to Chapter 7? Chapter 7. Reopening the closed. The petition to reopen the investigation landed on the NTSB's docket with unusual speed for a federal agency. Evidence of potential material omissions in contextual documentation, paired with newly recovered internal communications, got a hearing date on a calendar that usually moved like tectonic plates. The families of Flight 7028 gathered in a wood-paneled room where microphones amplified both voices and nerves. Evelyn sat at the table as a private citizen, a stack of binders at her elbow. Marcus adjusted his tie and tried not to look like a man who had finally met a ghost. Maya's mother squeezed her hand hard enough to leave half-moon marks. The panel chair, a woman with a pilot's calm, weighed each document with a thumb that had probably flipped through thousands of pages of lives summarized. Priya testified to the chain of custody of the tapes. Midge described the disc's long sleep. Owen explained maintenance culture without varnish or vengeance. Marcus read from handoff.ext and stopped twice to collect himself. Opposing counsel for Blue Ridge Airways, rebranded years ago after a merger and now flying under a name that sounded like a promise, argued that the documents reflected context, not cause. Weather had been real. Wind shear had been real. Pilots had agency. All true. But truth is a kaleidoscope. You turn it, and the pieces make a different picture without changing shape. When it was Maya's turn, she didn't try to be eloquent. For 27 years, she said, we've learned to live with an answer. It hurt, but it held. Now we have more of the picture. We're not asking you to change the past. We're asking you to write it down more accurately, so the next past someone lives through is better. In the hallway after, a reporter asked her if she was angry. Maya surprised herself by saying, I'm grateful. Angry comes and goes. Gratitude stays if you feed it. She was grateful for Ruthie at the thrift store, for Priya's stubbornness, for Midge's quiet integrity, for Owen's tired courage, for Marcus's appetite for pattern, for Evelyn's refusal to let process be the last word, and of course for Liam, who had made the last hour of his life larger than his fear. The board voted unanimously to amend the probable cause statement. Weather remained central, but organizational pressure and documentation practices that minimized operational anomalies were cited as contributing factors. Recommendations expanded. Stronger oversight of third-party documentation firms, clearer guidance on deferral narratives, audit trails that could not be harmonized into oblivion. On paper, it looked dry. In lives, it felt like oxygen flowing back into a room. Blue Ridge Airways, to their credit or their calculation, announced an internal review and committed to releasing a summary. The management services umbrella that had sheltered Tri-Needle closed its remaining shell companies within a month. Tri-Needle Consulting itself, long dissolved, became a cautionary tale in compliance seminars delivered with slide decks that made auditors feel dangerous for an hour. Maya visited the memorial wall again. She pressed her palm to Liam's name and whispered, "We found your forest. Do you want me to continue to Chapter 8? Chapter 8. The letter's second life. The letter did not go back into a freezer bag. It went into motion. A high school civics teacher used a redacted copy to teach about institutions and the people who move them. A museum of regional history borrowed it for an exhibit on the ways ordinary objects carry extraordinary weight. Maya agreed to read it aloud once for a recording that would play beside the display. When her voice trembled on, "The reason won't be weather," she didn't apologize. Trembling is also a form of truth. Marcus's piece ran under a headline that managed to be both sober and defiant. He didn't paint villains, he painted incentives. He explained how a narrative harmonization protocol could make 1,000 small, reasonable decisions add up to an unreasonable blind spot. He wrote about Liam without sanctifying him. "He was afraid," Marcus wrote. "He acted anyway." The sentence became a refrain. Evelyn returned to government work in a role where the words pattern of practice gave her leverage she had lacked as a junior investigator. Priya turned her attic archaeology into a grant-funded project that trained small municipalities to preserve digital records before time, and dust did it for them. Owen spoke to a room full of young mechanics and told them the story of a business card and a brass fob and a headache that didn't go away until he spoke. He said, "Most days you'll be the last line. Be proud of that. When someone tells you to be creative with the truth, remember that creativity belongs to art, not airworthiness." Maya and her mother started walking in the evenings again, the way they had before grief had turned time into a hallway with no doors. They said Liam's name without bracing. They argued about what to plant in the window box. They disagreed about wind chimes. In quiet moments, Maya thought about how a thrift store box had become the hinge of her life. How many other boxes waited for a retired librarian to notice a name? How many letters sit in drawers because someone told themselves it was safer for them to sleep? She began to see her city as a map of dormant stories, each waiting for a hand to lift the lid. When the exhibit closed, the museum director pressed the letter's envelope back into Maya's hand with a formality that felt like sacrament. He said, "We cleaned the glass once a day. People put their fingers on it." He smiled. "They always do. Do you want me to continue to Chapter 9? Chapter 9, Courtrooms and Kitchens. Justice moves like a convoy, a mix of fast and slow vehicles with different destinations. The amended cause statement didn't put anyone in handcuffs. It did, however, put depositions on calendars. It drew in-house counsel into rooms with stenographers and pitchers of water, and it forced executives to answer questions with verbs instead of brand values. A civil suit from a group of families alleged negligent documentation practices and reckless deference to a third-party firm that prioritized optics over clarity. The airline's defense was polished and not entirely wrong. Deferrals had followed FAA guidance, weather had been real, pilots retained authority. The plaintiff's case didn't need to prove malice. It needed to prove that a culture of euphemism had raised the probability of tragedy by turning a collection of not-quite issues into a gap wide enough to fall through. In one deposition, a former tri-needle consultant answered a question by saying, "We harmonized for consistency." The attorney asked, "Consistency with what?" The consultant paused so long the court reporter looked up. "With what would be most understandable," she said, "and acceptable." The transcript would later be read aloud on the evening news, the word acceptable landing with a dull thud. Settlements arrived. They were larger than the first round in 1999 and still smaller than any number a mother would say yes to in exchange for a life. Money does the job it can do. Therapy bills paid, student loans erased, roofs fixed, time bought. In kitchens, other kinds of justice unfolded. A maintenance chief wrote a letter of apology to his team for years of optimizing the truth. A dispatcher retired early and started volunteering at a weather education non-profit, teaching kids how to read radar and respect unpredictability. A young mechanic refused a sign-off on a bad day because she had heard Owen's story and decided that was the hill she would stand on. Maya attended a few court dates, then stopped. She realized her attendance wouldn't make answers truer. Instead, she focused on building a scholarship in Liam Carter's name for students going into aviation safety. People who would grow up to write reports with bones strong enough to bear more weight. One night, washing dishes, she asked her mother if she regretted reopening everything. Her mother dried a plate. "Regret is for choices we make to avoid pain," she said. "We made this choice to face it. That's different." Do you want me to continue to Chapter 10? Chapter 10, The Sky. Afterwards, grief teaches you to measure time in before and after. Justice, whatever shade of it you get, teaches you there's also during. In the during, you make dinner. You answer emails. You say thank you to a stranger who holds a door. You remember to replace the porch light bulb. And sometimes, in the middle of the during, the world gifts you a clear day and a contrail that draws a straight line across a blue so wide it feels like permission. On the 28th anniversary of Flight 708, Maya stood at the memorial with a small crowd. There were new faces, people who had found the story and felt moved to show up, to be witnesses of a kind. A choir sang a hymn that didn't pretend the world was less complicated than it is. The board chair, who had presided over the amendment, spoke briefly about institutional humility. Owen, in a suit he claimed he didn't own until that morning, pressed the brass fob into Maya's hand and said, "I think it was always meant for you." After the ceremony, Maya and Evelyn walked the perimeter where pine needles stitched the ground in brown. "You know," Evelyn said, "the thing about longleaf pines is they spend their first years looking like nothing, a grass stage. All the energy is going into roots you can't see. Then one day they decide to be a tree." Maya looked up. The branches moved the way crowds do when they make room for someone to pass. "We were roots for a long time," she said. They sat on a low stone wall and watched families drift toward cars, wheelchairs pivot over gravel, toddlers try to pocket pebbles. The world ticked at its normal speed again. The letter had done its work, and then some. It had found its people and changed its weight as it moved. Paper to evidence to artifact to story. Before they left, Maya took a moment. She spoke to the air like she would to a friend she expected to hear back from. "We did it," she said. "We told it right." Then, for herself, "We keep going." Back home, she slid the letter into a frame, not a vault, and hung it by the door. Every time she left the house, she would pass it and remember that the shortest distance between fear and something better is sometimes a straight line, and sometimes a looping path through thrift stores and attics and backup tapes and courtrooms. Either way, you walk it, you put the thing you love more than your fear in your pocket, and you move your body through space. She locked the door an extra time that night, as if to honor the part of her that still wanted to be careful. Then she slept, and the sky, being the sky, waited for morning.